Welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Reminder to catch us on all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Today, we are going to be talking about the intersection of AI and cryptocurrency, specifically the blockchain, and also potentially the impacts of the advancements of large language model training and compute plateauing or hitting a stall. So let's start with blockchain and AI. So setting the groundwork here, A16Z, specifically Mark and Ben, did a kind of prologue to the improvements and kind of the rapid acceleration we might be seeing for cryptocurrency in the coming years. And so, Shashi, I'm going to kick it to you first. Number one, what do you think about the kind of recent emergence of crypto, kind of coming back in the markets? We're seeing kind of all-time highs of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. How do we think that's going to play out over the next few years? And then also, what do we think the natural intersection of AI and cryptocurrency is?
Mark and Ben did an interesting pod in which they described a resurgence of crypto projects, crypto technology, crypto DeFi, and crypto banking, particularly as specific use cases. It's interesting to see kind of the Twitterverse shift energy from AI projects toward crypto projects, almost at the turn of a dime kind of transition. So all of a sudden, crypto is hot again, ladies and gentlemen. And crypto projects have emerged from another winter to see the sun once more. Ice is melting, and projects getting funded apparently. So that's been interesting to see a bunch of AI projects suddenly brand themselves and position themselves as crypto AI projects or crypto based projects. Just to summarize kind of the action in the market, Bitcoin is up at the time of recording to about 89,000 per coin. Ethereum's about 3,100. And my favorite coin, Solana, is at about $213 per coin. So what are we seeing? We're seeing kind of projects getting funded. We're seeing founders shifting energy toward crypto projects. And what is expected is that in the coming few years, we'll see a boot off the throat, as Mark Andreessen said, of the crypto industry, deregulation, and an opening of those markets to be more competitive, including Gary Gensler being replaced in his seat head of the SEC. So that's the environment of crypto and how Mark and Ben described it.
Okay. Thoughts on the intersection of AI and crypto?
I say this as someone who has like absolutely no intellectual engagement with crypto. I guess I'm just glad that I think a lot of SF in the Twitterverse are folks who just hop to hype waves. So I'm just glad that right now in AI, the pressure has reduced and the saturation is going away. I'm glad there's a different train to be on. So it's a little bit of choose your own adventure. I know a lot of people from like OpenAI Dev Day and such, like I was kind of surprised to learn how many people were like jumping pivots between these two things, crypto and AI. It's surprisingly really, really, really common. And I think that makes a lot of sense for like a technological innovator. I also think that attitude-wise, in general, SF and the Twitter sphere are folks who like are pretty techno optimists and are also like pretty just optimistic about like monetization in general. And I think just by virtue of what crypto is, it has a higher ceiling as an independent person than an AI tool does or an LLM product does, just by virtue of like how distribution of that thing works and the fact that it's a currency, like it has unlimited upside event potentially. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that people are getting excited about it again. I think it is generally good. I also recognize that I haven't watched this A16Z video, but they also have very specifically a crypto fund. So I imagine that they're very biased towards promoting crypto development. But that being said, I think crypto is interesting. From the exposure I've had to it in SF while I was there for like a couple months every here and now again, it felt to me very much like the crypto sphere sells products to itself, but they never really reach people otherwise. Like it's a bunch of like, I made infrastructure for this other consumer crypto startup to make, and they're making infrastructure that someone else is making. It's just kind of like a circle of A16Z money that just moves around SF and gets taxed effectively. But I think it's interesting. I think, especially what we talked about last week, where Polymarket was kind of the first kind of NFT project to go mainstream. I'm excited. I think it's actually proving that there is a way to make this thing work that can go mainstream. That's not just a bunch of dudes in SF passing cash around effectively.
On screen now is the CoinMarketCap crypto fear and greed index, which presently reads at 85, which is extreme greed. So just to give you a sense of like the temperature in terms of the crypto market, at least according to this index, we're at pretty high degree of greed.
I think both of you made some interesting points, and I want to take this in a slightly different direction and just kind of outline where else I think this might be leading to. And that is with specific respect to not cryptocurrency, but the actual blockchain technology itself. One of the most pervasive problems that we're seeing, especially globally in AI, is this idea of transparency and knowing who you're interacting with. So are you interacting with an AI? Are you interacting with a human? If you're interacting with an AI, how nefarious or well-intended is that AI? Fundamentally, at its core, blockchain technology allows for a level of traceability that is not present in other technologies. So you have, because of this tokenization, you can source things, you can describe where the things came from, and you can essentially authenticate or validate what is coming out of these systems. And so other countries, not the US, based on regulatory kind of restrictions or limits that were placed on previous blockchain technologies, are becoming more and more prevalent in other countries. And basically, these technologies are used as a way to verify, am I talking to an AI voice? Am I corresponding with an AI writer? Who owns this AI technology if it is AI? And then therefore, can I verify that this thing is benevolent or not based on kind of those signatures? And so one of the interesting things that I think we're going to see more and more of over the next few years is people leveraging tokenization in the blockchain to actually verify or validate AI. So you're going to see things like written by AI with an actual signature to say, how do I know where this was sourced from? How do I know where it's coming from? How do I verify the various steps this work, product, information, document, whatever it is, have come from? And who can I actually link it back to? So Leslie, I want to throw it to you. Any response to that as a principal idea? Any pros and cons you could maybe see from that?
Yeah, we've talked about this sort of concept of, like, in the context of what ScholarAI is, the idea of papers as tokenizable objects, so they're fully traceable. I think that makes a lot of sense. Honestly, I think it's very intuitive that, especially as we're beginning to do more AI generated content, the hope is that folks are having to read less arcane writing and they're having to write in higher quality. It makes a lot of sense that, like, AI is involved in both parts of that loop. You just need to be aware of when you are consuming AI. That way you can be a conscious consumer rather than just kind of blindly eating stuff up and having to worry about authenticity or even just correctness of the machine. I think it's generally a really good idea. And we've talked about a lot internally, or just, I guess there's been a random enthusiasm for folks on the team, like just chatting about state of affairs over a course of a week of what if things generated on our platform were NFTs effectively. Like, what if we could say, you wrote something, this is now marked and labeled as yours. So when someone cites it or tries to plagiarize it or tries to, like, chase it down in some way or another, it's very, very easy to. I think it's a good idea. I'm just not avant-garde enough to know how to do that, to be honest. But I think it makes a lot of sense, especially with all the problems we're seeing with AI tools now, where authenticity and, like, trusting what it's doing is kind of at its core. Blockchain makes a lot of sense in being able to add a lot of trust. I think to the consumer of these systems, I don't know how much that's going to matter, but I think for the folks who are using these systems very critically, it matters a lot, right? So we're talking about, like, educators, professors. We're talking about folks who are writing, like, legal contracts, where knowing where material came from matters a lot. Could be really, really useful. Is that something OpenAI does? I don't think so, but I think it would make a lot of sense for someone to in partnership.
Dan, to react to your question about provenance and security in terms of provenance, data provenance, where did data come from? Who owns data is clearly a problem that is being addressed and considered. And part of that data could be user data. So are you interacting with data that is authentically from a user, or machine generated data that is meant to look like a user's data? And are you interacting with a real person, or are you interacting, for example, with your bank or a system that's intended to look like your bank to extract your personal identification information and therefore steal from you. So these are the kinds of emergent problems that we are seeing, and authentication systems like you're describing, perhaps using crypto, could be a solution. I would my gut feel is that Bitcoin is not the coin for that, because the costs, the gas costs of completing a crypto transaction are just so high, even with these alternate kind of sidechain implementations of using Bitcoin specifically for that. That's why I think so many altcoins have emerged to be able to be very fast, low cost, and complete a lot of these kinds of daily transactional things that maybe Bitcoin isn't well suited for. Bitcoin is very well suited for a store of value, but not as a medium of exchange, I think is what we're finding.
I think that's really well said. And just expanding on this, and with the obvious disclaimer that none of this is financial advice, it does feel like Bitcoin is gravitating more towards a reserve currency, potentially, whereas alternative chains like the Ethereum blockchain being the preeminent example is where a lot of these tokenized transactions are taking place. So things like Polymarket, things like OpenSea, which is the largest, or at least was at its height, marketplace for NFTs, as Lakshay you were describing, are all built on various parts of the Ethereum blockchain. And so I do think that you're making a really prescient point there, Shashi, in that depending on what kind of bet you want to make, cryptocurrency itself or the blockchain technology, that probably leads you down different lines of thinking. As a tangent,
I have a question, actually.
No, shoot.
If I believe you both know much more about crypto than I do generally. I guess, what is the differentiator between chains? Like you mentioned, Shashi, you have a favorite coin. You mentioned like Ethereum and blockchain or Bitcoin have different utilities. What is the core reason those two things, or like those chains, are different? Is gas fees? Like, what are the differentiators that lead someone to choose, here's why I use one chain for this purpose versus another?
So one of the big differences is proof of work versus proof of stake. So I'm going to just screen share. So this is again from CoinMarketCap. Proof of stake means you possess the coin. It is a component of possession. Proof of work is solving, for example, the Bitcoin mining equation, which is to identify a sequence in a random number generation and provide that as essentially an unlock token to receive your reward for unlocking the mathematical formula. And I'll just add that as Bitcoin matures and has more and more transactions, more and more blocks on its chain, this equation becomes harder and harder to solve over time, consuming more and more power and more compute resource. So it is inherently not built for volume. It is built to degrade, to get worse with volume, as a mathematical problem to solve. And that inherently makes it not very scalable. What it provides is, if you lived in a country where you didn't trust your currency, let's say Argentina, before Javier Milei became president, was printing money. It was just printing money nonstop to pay its debt obligations. If you lived in a country like that, you would much rather hold blockchain or US dollars than your local currency, because your local currency is in hyper devaluation mode. And so in those situations where you live, and many people live in these countries where their currency is just not as reliable as Bitcoin or as the US dollar. And you can imagine people in those scenarios holding crypto instead of holding their domestic currency. And so those are the scenarios in which a store of value makes a lot of sense. You aren't transacting on that all the time, hopefully not much at all, but it may be where you store your value and you have your key. And if you don't trust your government, or if you're worried that your government might try to seize your assets, then having the Bitcoin-based private key as the primary means of access adds a layer of security.
And the thing that I would add to that is, as Shashi was alluding to, fundamentally, these two systems, just comparing Bitcoin and Ethereum, were set up for different things. Ethereum was kind of started under the ethos of blockchain transactions and this idea of lower cost, lower latency tracing of the kind of transactions that were happening. That's why we've seen I think a proliferation of technologies being built on that blockchain versus Bitcoin, which was originally ideated, at least if you believe kind of the original white paper, to be an alternative form of currency, primarily not a blockchain platform to be used as a kind of tokenization ledger, if you will. I do think there's another interesting intersection that we're alluding to here, and Josh, you mentioned it predominantly, so I'll throw it back to you quickly here. Energy consumption. We've talked about energy a lot as respect to AI, but if we do see an intersection of cryptocurrency and AI, both of those technology platforms, even independently, are some of the largest consumers of energy we have seen. And now if we are seeing a kind of marrying or a union of those two, what do you think is going to happen to the energy consumptions and then thereby the demands of new energy production?
I've been having several conversations with people in the energy industry. Living in Texas, I meet lots of energy industry people. There are two major sources by which the U.S. can rapidly increase our energy over the next roughly 5 years. One is nuclear. That would mean the construction of nuclear plants, reviving existing nuclear plants to continue their lifetime. And so that takes years of development. These are large sites. But nuclear it's continuing to become more and more safe. And so nuclear power as an option will inevitably need to grow if we are to power all of the data centers we imagine we will need. The second is gas. We have lots of gas. I was told yesterday by a friend that if you set up a data center in the Permian in Texas, you basically get free gas. And there's so much gas that it's basically free or verging on free. So location matters a lot. And if you can help the gas producers avoid transportation costs, then there are very abundant sources of energy in the United States. And the United States is in an incredibly blessed position to have found so much energy over the last 10 years that the United States is now, I believe it's the largest energy producer in the world. And we are effectively energy independent, which wasn't the case when we've talked a lot about globalization on this pod, and that's one of the major changes that has happened on the global scene. Is the U.S. energy production industry has really grown, and the discoveries of energy domestically have really grown. So those take years. The nuclear plants and leveraging gas to fuel data centers in the United States, but both of those are viable approaches. There will be a lot of energy needed for new data centers. So what's the demand function? The demand function for a data center is almost entirely connected to the demand for large language models. And the demand for large language models is still unsatisfied. We're going to talk about next how large language models may or may not be improving going forward with more data and more compute. But even with the existing data, existing compute, using things like chain of thought and agentic reasoning, we're finding lots of use cases to apply large language models as they are. And that demand has not been satisfied. And so what we will continue to see is data centers come online that need energy, they need cooling, they need racks, they need a bunch of commodity parts that need to be supplied and configured. So there are lots of vendors involved in a data center. And all of those vendors have essentially unlimited demand right now, based on just the demand function of large language models as they exist today.
Akshay, any thoughts on the consumption of energy, both from AI and crypto?
While you were both speaking about energy, I just stumbled on, this is just a sidebar before I will actually answer your question. But I guess like a thing I am just like curious about is just like, if the whole value of Bitcoin is based on the difficulty of these mathematical problems being solved, continuing to get hard, I was just wondering like what happens when we get to quantum computing? Like if that does eventually happen, is that just inherently deflationary to what crypto is? And there's a whole lot of interesting stuff there. I like kind of ended up in a rabbit hole just like reading an article about like what happens to security when you assume quantum computers, what actually happens to all the traceability and like mockability of these signatures that these coins have, which I'll pocket for later. I just thought that was really interesting and really like I stumbled into something I didn't want to, and now I'm learning stuff, but I thought I'd just call out because it was cool. On the topic of LMs and crypto and what that means for energy, I think as always, we are going to be running up into a world where it is at the end of the day electrons that are holding us back. It's not going to be like data. Like it's always going to be driven by how many electrons we can drive through a system and how present they are anywhere. I think I have a lot of optimism for just like how we solve the energy problem in general. I think like what we talk with like nuclear, what we talk about with gas, I don't think it's impossible to solve. It's just inherently harder to get faster innovation in that category than it is with software or a data problem or a user problem, right? I think with eventually in the future, I also think that we are moving more and more towards edge computing. And I think like a lot of stuff will be served by primary big data centers and data like serving physical locations. But I do think that in time, especially as the use cases for these models just become smaller and smaller, it does become, I think, a little bit of serve your own use case. You can kind of prop up a model that's not talking to a server necessarily. It's just part of the offering of the sort of equipment or stuff you're buying for your home or your furniture, or the IoT you're getting, that will hopefully reduce the energy burden on like a global level, because it is kind of choose your own adventure. You use energies you kind of need to supply the tool you are getting. Ultimately, LLMs are something that, again, vast majority of people don't know how to use them well. There is a very small percentage of people who know how to use them brilliantly. And I think when you kind of get to the conversation like, oh, we're finally approaching AGI and I can just talk to a piece of glass to solve my problem, it will start putting a burden on data centers first very, very early. But I assume that in time that will move away to putting the onus of hosting, energy, et cetera, on the individual consumer. I think it just needs to kind of get to there. So it becomes less of a data center problem, more of an energy one.
It's fascinating. Do you think we're going to see a proliferation then in kind of more powerful devices, meaning like a lot of the innovation in the newer iPhone series or the newer furniture series, whether dishwashers or autonomous robots inside, with the ability to run these on-prem large language models is going to come with some fairly intensive compute demand. So what you might see is a kind of a growing of chip costs in each one of these individual machines versus that flowing up to the energy grid.
Yeah, I think so. I think enough people are really interested in this space that there is innovation coming in the chip space sooner rather than later. I mean, we already know that there are folks who like the ideal state of like quantum computing is that everyone has a Q chip inside their computer that handles problems that are specifically tailored for quantum. In the same way, I mean, what I've heard is that these computers are kind of awful, but Microsoft has made computers that are special for LLMs and running like a local model. I've heard they're terrible, but in time, I'm sure they'll get pretty okay. Where just in the same way you have a CPU, now we have a GPU. All sorts of people are already making chips customized for running inference on LLMs really, really fast. They're out there. They're not serving consumer goods. They're even just beginning to serve like industry cases. But once we get there, I think it'll be pretty common that's treated as normal, that the LLM running on my machine is doing XYZ job. It's not having to talk to a server to do that sort of thing.
And there's precedent for this as well. I mean, there's been gaming computers for decades now in which the primary intent was gaming. I do see a fairly clear analog there to where you do have computers built for AI inference. And sure, maybe they aren't good now, but those are certainly going to continue to get better.
Just to respond to the overlap between crypto and quantum. So this has been kind of a running concern or theory that quantum computing, when it's capable enough, can decode private keys and steal crypto. I've been hearing about this threat for at least 10 years. The quantum industry is nascent. It's early. It's not ready yet for that kind of application, but when it is, it will absolutely pose a risk to all of the, for example, the SHA-128 based passwords are definitely under threat. The 256 are definitely under threat. And the private keys for crypto are definitely under threat as that industry matures, which is not today. And so that's sort of a known concern. My expectation would be that the existing coins that survive the next kind of 5 to 10 years will all upgrade their security to be better postured against quantum computing based attacks. And I would expect that there will be public stories of passwords being decoded, decrypted, whatever word you want to assign to that, using quantum computing, and then everyone being forced to kind of upgrade their security. There's probably room for a very large new security company that protects businesses and government entities from quantum-based attacks.
Excellent. Shashi, you alluded to it earlier. Let's go to a new report out of Bloomberg and others that the largest large language model training companies such as OpenAI, Anthropic, Google are running into potentially a glass ceiling for large language model performance. So essentially, the addition of new data sets are becoming more and more difficult to find. And even when trying to train these large language models with additional compute, they are finding diminishing returns in kind of the growth or the increased power of these systems. So, Lakshay, let's start with you. What is your kind of initial response to that as a premise? Do you believe it? Do you not believe it? And then speculate, if you would, about which of those two paths you feel is more likely in the outcomes of each path.
Yeah, I do. I think the one thing that's interesting is I think more than before, I've been empathetic to the case to be bearish on AI, which is just like, I just like talking to folks at big companies who are engaged in the sort of like AI ML space. It was really interesting to me to hear them speak about Gen AI and just like, we have bigger problems that are not going to get solved by AI. Like we have like, again, there's all sorts of stuff happening between like, how does supply chain work? How is like the distribution of my product going to work? How does the distribution of my service going to work? Where a lot of folks are saying like, yes, we can generate documents better. Yes, we can make knowledge traversal easier, but that's not gonna make a delta of like the millions or hundreds of millions of dollars that our business needs to justify how expensive it is to run this thing. I think in response to your specific question, I think the way I've been looking at AI in general is that it's a convenience tool for the individual worker inside of a big firm right now. I think that leads to a lot of the problems that we're seeing, where there's just like a low willingness to hand over really interesting data that would then hopefully supply what is a really powerful development, right? We haven't seen, even multimodal still kind of sucks, to be honest. Like it's still kind of terrible. It's not able to do everything you kind of wish it would. But that comes with people sharing all sorts of really, really interesting, non-standard images of stuff, right? And images are not getting passed around. The folks who probably have interesting documentation of that variety are private filings or private documents that can't be shared for the sake of training data. And so I do understand why OpenAI, Gemini, I guess I understand why that thesis of that report exists. It makes a lot of logical sense. I think the way that you end up breaking past that ends up being on the assumption of privacy and security, where those companies own their own models at some point. I don't think you can't really get past that. And that also assumes that those companies are interested in training, which then runs into the hardware, the energy problem, all that sort of stuff. It's just a little bit of a catch-22, I think. A lot of users, they use ChatGPT 4.0. They don't even know that there are differences in the model. They just know it as ChatGPT and they keep on hitting it. 0.1 is interesting. I think it's very, very capable, but the average user doesn't derive that much value from it, right? And so there's just ultimately this kind of weird game of, yes, consumers can give you all the data in the world, but if they're not engaging with your tool in new, novel ways, it doesn't lead to more new, interesting data on which to act.
The large language model as we know it is the result of two important inputs. One is the Google Brain paper, the attention is all you need paper, which describes the LLM architecture. And the second is the Common Crawl data set as kind of the massive internet data set that is used to train a large language model. Not exclusively used, it's used in addition to other things, but it is one of the key data set pieces that is used to train all of these large language models. What we're seeing is an asymptotic top to performance, what we think of as how good, quote unquote, a large language model is in adding more compute and more data as supplementary to that. And so what is the finding? Like large language models are maturing, quote unquote, in terms of capability based on those two inputs. So the kind of the transformer architecture that was laid out and the core data set. So if large language models are to fundamentally get better, one of those two things needs to change. Either we design a new architecture for models and have some other model as a complementary or a performance increase from this existing model, or we have an entirely different kind of data set and application in mind for this. So I think what we're moving from is a one size fits all kind of general purpose, everything's a nail, here's your hammer, to now this next phase where not everything is a nail. Sometimes you need a forklift, and sometimes you need an art studio. You kind of need a variety of different tools, not just the one super tool. And I think we're now moving into this next phase where general consumer needs may be met by this generalized product, but now any kind of really heavy lift product is going to need its own specialized tooling, whether that's modifying the data or the transformer architecture. So I'll just kind of screen share a couple of things that I think are interesting about this. So here's the PDF of the Attention is All You Need paper. And this is kind of the fundamental building block that the large language models have been developed out of, especially OpenAI as kind of the leader in kind of bringing this to market. And then switching over, here's just another thought and reaction to what we're saying about large language models. So we've seen now large language models move up this Gartner hype cycle from kind of an innovation trigger, which was really this paper, and then OpenAI's massive commitment to this and the founding of OpenAI. We've seen this peak of inflated expectations, and now I think what we're describing is this realization, at least from the people who work in AI every day, that we're moving down this slope toward the trough of disillusionment. We aren't fully, in my opinion, at that place of trough of disillusionment, but generative AI is past that kind of the one solution for all problems thought process. And now we're moving down into what will likely be over the next 2 years, much more sober consideration of what large language models can and can't do. And then we will eventually emerge out of that into some incredible companies where the real money is made in an industry when products move out of the trough of disillusionment and up into this plateau of productivity. So that's what we'll see beyond that. The next couple of years of disillusionment, we'll see incredible companies built and made through that slope of enlightenment and into this plateau of productivity.
Yeah, I think the thing that is continuing to rise to the top of my memory here is the Bloomberg experiment, in which they fine-tuned GPT 3.5 to outperform the vanilla GPT 3.5, only to be overtaken by GPT 4 upon its model release. And I think that this report, if true, fundamentally changes the landscape on whether or not these large business investments in fine-tuning become now warranted. And said that a different way, it is, if we are seeing diminishing returns and this kind of flattening of the growth curve of the foundational model, then building specialized tooling on top of those foundational models now becomes imperative for solving those business use cases that we're kind of talking about. And so I think fascinating things to come. Lakshay, any response to any of that?
Yeah, I think the example you brought up of that, was it? I don't know which company was it. And you literally just said, I just blinked. It's early.
Bloomberg.
I apologize.
It was financial model.
Nice.
But yeah.
Yeah. Like their fine-tuned model, I guess it's not super surprising that when you are just changing the way that it's printing out text, that you were kind of bound to get squashed by the next model improvement. Because I don't remember if they trained on GPT 2 or 3, but I think there was a pretty significant step between what 4 was and what O1 was. Like I think those are the most measurable step ups that I would like label as having happened. I think the problem in trying to play that game of I'm using fine tuning to make the model more aware of my knowledge, I think that's a losing game. I think that's very, very much a losing game where a lot of startups, even there's so many startups who are squashed every OpenAI Dev Day because they try to solve what are problems with the model that are inherently going to get solved by a company wanting to make their model super widespread and generally usable, right? So I think there is kind of a little bit of this like fear game where right now it's just super expensive to invest in this stuff at like a corporate level. Like it's a very, very expensive investment to say, I'm going to make a Gen AI initiative. Yes, politically, for the sake of your like working group, it's super cool to be the Gen AI team in your company or whatever it may be. But that stops you from all of a sudden budgetary constraints. How do we serve a Gen AI use case to all of our consumers? Wait a minute, now that's costing way too much per user. Now this thing is not making any financial sense. Let's go back to solving the problem of like our data is messy or something. And I think when you put all those that sort of stuff in combination, it's going to be hard to get really high movement on these sort of like upending solves, because startups, the folks who are kind of most naturally inclined to do more revolutionary, like taking a different approach to the problem sort of angles, are going uphill against attitudes about OpenAI, attitudes about Google, attitudes about defensibility against all these three major providers. And on the other end, in corporate settings, it's just way too expensive right now to be able to do that sort of innovation. It's not cheap too, right? I think right now, the sort of step changes we're describing likely come out of the academic system, and from the academic system then into these providers. So if someone in Berkeley or Stanford or MIT or whosoever comes up with a really novel approach to these problems, odds are they just end up getting roped into one of these big provider companies and starting the next big wave, I suppose, in the same way what I assume happened with Sora or similar.
I would love to see a new model built from scratch to modify the transformer algorithm to fundamentally be built on love for people. And ultimately, like this idea of like safe superintelligence, like this notion needs to be built off of genuine caring and love for the end user, the human being. I think if there was a path to re-architect this transformer architecture to be built on empathy and love for people, and then kind of all of the recommendations therefore coming out of it would be based on that model of empathy and love for the end human being. What you would see is, I think the end result would be robotics, would be recommendations, text generation. All of these outputs that we're seeing have interlaced within it empathy for what the end user is trying to achieve and who they might fundamentally be as a person. I think that's probably a better place to start than an unfeeling transformer model.
Very interesting thought. I wonder, in response to both that and the thing that you said last there, Lakshay, do we see an opening here, maybe an increased opening for open source? If that is the case, whether it is a new model architecture or it is just simply the limitations that these companies are finding internally, and what we really need to do is outsource different ways of potentially solving this problem beyond just data and compute. Do we think there's a space to be carved there then in the open source community?
I mean, I think I treat open source and research as at least like pretty tied. I think if someone were to make a discovery about like, if someone were to make a pretty theoretical discovery saying like, I have this new model, here's how it might hypothetically work and what it could do if it does, that would lead to a lot of change. I think right now it's, again, like even the open source community is tied to hype cycles. It's very, very tied to hype cycles. So everyone who's developing something open source, LangChain, Llama Index, of course they're a layer above the LM, but even like smaller BERT models, fine-tuned models for certain use cases, are all assuming transformer models are the way to go. I think there's just not a lot of gravity right now for what an alternative model might look like, which, again, I assume that some PhD or some postdoc somewhere in the world is thinking about this question differently, but it's almost like there's almost like a marketing game to making that sort of thing get open source traction to then make the sort of impact you're expecting it to, right? It can't just happen because it exists.
I have a tangential question, if you don't mind, Dan. We saw ChatGPT release their Google competitor, including a browser plugin. I wonder how you see Google search and the defensibility of Google search in light of what LLMs can presently do.
I think it's a fascinating question. I think number one, I think there are two threads that I would like to pull on just in response to that question. Number one, search is not inherently a problem that is fundamentally built for large language models. And what I mean by that is search tends to be a deterministic problem with a single best quote unquote solution. Large language models are probabilistic and stochastic by nature. Therefore, the current competitor, quote unquote, that OpenAI has released in comparison to Google search, I find far less accurate. And specifically, I have found that the ChatGPT based search tends to conflate evidence across the internet and give you the wrong answer. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, if you asked for Google's market capitalization over the last 10 years and asked it to output that information into a chart, it is very likely that it would confuse evidence from one year or the other year and then chart those inaccurately. Or, as a counterexample, if you ask for the market cap of the 10 largest companies in the world, it wouldn't necessarily take the snapshot of the current top 10. It might take the historical records of the peaks of each of those companies and then list those in a top 10. So I find these very somewhat nuanced errors that the search based on a large language model is making, whereas the deterministic search does not make that. So I think to answer your question, I still am of the opinion that it's yet to be determined whether or not search can be solved with a stochastic engine at its core, or do you need a purely deterministic engine at the core of search? If search can be solved by a stochastic engine, then I think inherently Google has a massive problem, and therefore whoever is best at large language models will ultimately win search. If it kind of proves to be the case that you need a deterministic engine at the center of search, I think in that world, Google is still incredibly well positioned because objectively speaking, they probably still have the best deterministic engine for search. I do think as a tangent to that and less on the kind of technical side of it, I think it has been a somewhat of a coup in that OpenAI has owned the verb in this new search. So a lot of people stat things now with reference to ChatGPT rather than Googling things with reference to searching the internet. So I think almost two different thresholds, both of which I think are highly relevant there.
Yeah, when Search GPT came out and they announced that browser plugin, I was actually pretty excited, to be honest. I think of anyone to be worried, like Google really doesn't need to be super pressed. I don't think they just have too much like embedded involvement in what is the user flow. I imagine this is more towards Perplexity. But I was kind of stunned first time using like a search first LLM system. I haven't used Perplexity before. I haven't tried to like use it beyond just like looking at what it does. I was kind of surprised in just what I find problematic for these systems is generally when I'm still using Google for something, it's because the thing I'm looking for is very precise, right? I was doing a Secret Santa with friends and I was just like, hey, help me find options for this one thing. Here's like the general idea of what I have set up. And the problem is it's so limited by here are the websites I can crawl. OpenAI compared to what Perplexity was doing back in the days, being much safer and much more respecting of how you crawl the website. And I think it's doing search first, very LM oriented, and then summarization LM oriented. Both those steps have to respect a lot of rules that websites have. And that way the quality of the result felt pretty reduced. Even if theoretically this will probably take off and do really, really well. I think the reverse order of I have a deterministic search system and I'm just doing LLM summarization of the results I can read works better because in general, when I am searching for something, I'm not looking for general summary. I'm looking for a very specific result. And that specific result is currently better found by a deterministic system, which is what Google has.
Yeah, excellent question and an excellent place to close this podcast. So thanks everyone for joining us for this week's episode of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Be sure to catch us next week on the typical podcast locations and check us out on our YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us. See you all next week.